What if the perfect crime wasn't a murder, but a lie? How does a woman die, only to reappear in the most shocking way imaginable? What if the suspect, the one with the strongest motive, the one whose fingerprints are everywhere, is innocent? Let's dive into the most twisted, jaw-dropping true crime case you've never heard before. It all began in Montgomery, Alabama, a city rich with history, faith, and secrets. Pastor Elijah Brooks, a man of deep conviction and a golden voice that sent shivers down spines during Sunday service, was beloved by his congregation. His wife, Regina Brooks, was just as revered, a picture of grace, always dressed immaculately. Her smile disarming, her devotion to the church unwavering. But beneath the polished exterior, cracks had begun to form. Regina had a sister, Desiree Warren. They were blood, but that bond had been frayed for years, torn apart by resentment, jealousy, and a history of unspoken betrayals. Desiree, younger by 3 years, had always been the rebellious one, the one who pushed boundaries, while Regina was the obedient, God-fearing firstborn who clung to tradition. Desiree was the wild child, the one who ran away at 16, the one who found herself entangled with the law more times than she cared to admit. Their childhood had been filled with bitter competition, each vying for their mother's attention in different ways. Regina excelled academically, earning praise from teachers and community leaders, while Desiree, feeling overshadowed, sought approval through defiance, sneaking out, skipping school, and eventually running with the wrong crowd. The final rift came when their mother fell ill. Regina had stayed behind, tending to her in her last days, while Desiree, unreachable for months, only showed up at the funeral. The look of contempt in Regina's eyes that day had been seared into Desiree's memory, a silent judgment that spoke louder than any words could. Regina had tried to erase Desiree from her life after that. She never spoke of her, never acknowledged her. Even when Desiree tried to make amends years later, Regina kept her at arm's length, unwilling to let her sister back in. Their rare encounters had been cold, almost rehearsed, with Regina keeping her emotions under lock and key. But Desiree had always been persistent, knocking on doors that Regina wished would stay shut. The last time they met before the tragedy, it had been at a charity gala at the church. Desiree, invited by Elijah under the guise of reconciliation, had walked in with hesitant steps, as if expecting Regina to turn her away at any moment. Regina had stiffened at the sight of her but forced a smile for the crowd. The tension was palpable, and when no one was looking, she pulled Desiree aside. "You don't belong here," Regina hissed, her fingers digging into her sister's wrist. "Stay away from my life, from my husband." The last time they met before the tragedy, it had been at a charity gala at the church. Desiree, invited by Elijah under the guise of reconciliation, had walked in with hesitant steps, as if expecting Regina to turn her away at any moment. Regina had stiffened at the sight of her but forced a smile for the crowd. The tension was palpable, and when no one was looking, she pulled Desiree aside. "You don't belong here," Regina hissed, her fingers digging into her sister's wrist. "Stay away from my life, from my husband." Desiree had yanked her hand away, her eyes flashing with defiance. "I came here to make things right," she whispered, her voice thick with frustration. "But I see now, you'll never let that happen." Regina's lips curled into something resembling a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "You're right, I won't." And yet, somehow, she had found her way back into the church, back into Elijah's life, and, as investigators would soon discover, back into his bed. Before we continue, please take a moment to subscribe and turn on the notification bell to stay updated. Your support means everything to us, and we're truly grateful to have you here. Thank you. It was a Tuesday morning when the church secretary, Sister Lorraine, dialed 911. She had gone to check on Regina after the pastor missed their early morning prayer meeting. She found the doors slightly ajar, a sick feeling creeping up her spine as she stepped inside. The house was eerily silent, the type of silence that makes your skin crawl. She hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open fully, her heart pounding in her chest. As she entered the dimly lit living room, the first thing she noticed was the overturned glass on the coffee table, its contents forming a dark stain on the expensive rug beneath. The smell of iron thickened in the air, assaulting her senses. Her breath hitched as her eyes finally landed on the lifeless figure sprawled across the floor, Regina Brooks, her silk nightgown clinging to her body, the fabric stained in deep crimson. A knife rested inches from her pale fingers, its silver blade glinting ominously in the morning light. Sister Lorraine's shaky hands covered her mouth as she stumbled back, barely registering the sound of her own muffled scream. Her knees threatened to give out beneath her, but she forced herself to remain standing. She fumbled for her phone, her hands slick with sweat, and punched in the 3 numbers that would change everything. 911. "What's your emergency?" came the voice on the other end. I think she's dead," Lorraine stammered, her voice breaking. "Regina Brooks. She's been murdered." The smell of blood was unmistakable. Regina Brooks lay in the living room, her silk nightgown stained red, a knife resting just inches from her hand. The room was eerily still, the air thick with the scent of blood and something metallic. A broken glass lay on the coffee table, its contents soaking into the plush beige carpet, a stark contrast to the deep crimson pooling beneath her motionless body. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no frantic claw marks on the floor or walls. Just an eerie, deliberate precision to it all. A single, deep wound to her abdomen. A silent, precise strike. The blade had entered cleanly, missing vital arteries but ensuring she bled out over time. The position of her body was unsettling, her head slightly turned toward the entryway, as if she had seen her killer before the fatal wound was delivered. Her hands, frozen in time, bore no defensive wounds, suggesting she hadn't fought back. A nearby lamp flickered, casting long, wavering shadows across the crime scene, and the silence in the house stretched, oppressive and heavy. Whoever had done this had meant for it to be clean, a message, not a crime of passion, a calculated, cold act. The police arrived quickly, and within hours, the focus shifted to one person, Desiree Warren. She had been seen arguing with Regina just days before. Their confrontation at the cafe had been nothing short of explosive. Heated words thrown across the table, Desiree's face contorted with frustration, while Regina's was an unreadable mask of cold fury. Witnesses had seen Regina storm out, her hands clenched into fists, her lips trembling with unsaid words. A neighbor later swore they had heard shouting coming from the house the night prior to Regina's murder. The yelling had gone on for nearly 20 minutes, muffled at first, then escalating into shrieks and sobs. A loud crash followed, as if something heavy had been thrown against a wall. The neighbor, hesitant to intervene in what seemed like another family dispute, had peeked through their curtains and glimpsed Desiree pacing back and forth on the porch before storming off into the night. And most damning of all, Regina had confided in her best friend that she knew about the affair between her husband and her sister. "She's a snake," Regina had hissed, gripping her friend's wrist so tightly it left marks. "And I will not let her ruin my life." When pressed about what she intended to do, she had simply smiled, a knowing, chilling expression that left her friend uneasy. "Desiree has no idea what's coming for her," Regina had whispered before walking away. It was a statement that, in hindsight, carried a weight no one could have imagined. "She told me she was going to put a stop to it," the friend said tearfully. Desiree was arrested that evening. The case seemed open and shut, until it wasn't. 2 weeks later, as the town still reeled from the scandal, as Desiree sat in a cold jail cell proclaiming her innocence, as Elijah mourned his wife publicly while drowning in whiskey privately, rumors spread like wildfire through Montgomery. Whispers echoed in church pews, hair salons, and grocery store aisles. People speculated about Desiree's guilt, about Elijah's sorrow, and about the eerie nature of Regina's death. Some claimed they had seen a shadowy figure lurking near the Brooks' home in the days leading up to the crime, while others were convinced that Regina had known something dark and had paid the price for it. Meanwhile, Desiree's time in jail was nothing short of agonizing. Every night, she lay awake on the cold, hard cot, replaying every moment, every interaction she had with Regina in the weeks before her supposed murder. The walls seemed to close in around her, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead a constant reminder of the nightmare she had been thrust into. She had been wrongfully accused before, but this time was different. This time, the world had already made up its mind about her. She could hear the murmurs of the guards outside her cell, their hushed voices thick with suspicion. Other inmates gave her looks, some of pity, some of quiet judgment. The news had spread through the facility. "Pastor's mistress kills his wife." The headlines had been merciless. Even in prison, she was branded a traitor, a homewrecker, a killer. Sleep was elusive. Every time she closed her eyes, Regina's face appeared in her mind. The last time they had spoken, Regina's voice had been filled with venom, her words sharp as daggers. "I won't let you destroy everything I built," Regina had spat. Those words now echoed in her head like a ghostly whisper, haunting her. Had that been a warning? Had Regina known something was about to happen? One evening, as she lay on her cot, she heard the rattling of keys. A guard stood at her cell, an unreadable expression on his face. "You have a visitor?" he said flatly. A visitor? Desiree's stomach twisted. Who would come to see her? Not Elijah. He had disappeared into grief and disgrace. Not the church congregation. They had turned their backs on her. As she walked down the dimly lit hallway, her pulse pounded in her ears. She stepped into the visiting room and froze. It wasn't a friend. It wasn't a lawyer. It was a woman she had never seen before. Yet something about her was eerily familiar. The woman leaned forward and smirked, her piercing eyes locking onto Desiree's. "You don't know me, but I know you. And I know what really happened that night." Desiree's breath hitched. There was something unsettling about the stranger. Her confidence, the way she carried herself. She wasn't just some curious onlooker. She had a purpose. "Who are you?" Desiree finally managed to whisper, her throat dry. The woman tilted her head slightly, as if amused by the question. "I go by many names, but let's just say I was close to Regina. Closer than you think." Desiree's heart pounded. Every muscle in her body tensed. Was this some cruel joke? Another trick? Had Regina orchestrated yet another betrayal from beyond the grave? The woman leaned in, lowering her voice. "She planned everything, down to the last detail. But there's something she didn't count on." Desiree swallowed hard. "What?" The woman smiled, slow and deliberate. "Me." A cold shiver ran down Desiree's spine. Whoever this woman was, she held a secret, a piece of the puzzle that no one else had. And for the first time, Desiree felt that maybe, just maybe, the nightmare wasn't over yet. The woman leaned back, studying Desiree with a quiet amusement, as if savoring the suspense. "You think you know the whole story, don't you?" she murmured, tapping her long nails against the scratched surface of the visitation table. "You think Regina was the mastermind, that she planned everything on her own. But tell me, Desiree, do you believe in ghosts?" Desiree's breath hitched, her fingers gripping the edge of her chair. "What are you talking about?" The woman chuckled softly, shaking her head. Regina wasn't the only one pulling strings. She had help, and not just from Sharon Miles. Desiree's stomach twisted. She had thought she knew how deep the deception went, but something in the woman's gaze told her she had only scratched the surface. "Who?" she whispered. The woman leaned in, her breath warm against Desiree's ear. "You'll find out soon enough, but you should be careful. The real players in this game, they're still out there, and they don't like loose ends." Elijah, too, was unraveling. The once charismatic pastor had become a ghost of himself, his eyes sunken, his voice hollow. The weight of the scandal had driven away many members of his congregation, leaving him to drown his sorrows in private. In his drunken stupor, he would sometimes swear he saw Regina standing in the doorway, her silhouette illuminated by the moonlight, her eyes full of something unreadable. Was it accusation, or was it amusement? Alive, breathing, smiling. Montgomery PD had never seen anything like it. Regina, it turned out, had spent the last 2 weeks holed up in a motel under a fake name, watching the chaos unfold. It was all part of her plan, a perfect frame-up. She had meticulously planned every detail, from forging a fake passport to withdrawing cash in increments to avoid suspicion. She knew Montgomery PD would follow the trail she left behind, a carefully constructed puzzle leading straight to Desiree. In the motel, she followed the news, smirking as she saw the headlines accusing her sister of murder. Every detail had fallen into place perfectly. But what she hadn't accounted for was the loneliness. Despite the victory of watching her scheme play out, an unsettling emptiness crept in. She missed the adoration of the congregation, the security of home, and the control she had over her world. Lying on the stiff motel bed, she found herself staring at the ceiling, questioning if revenge truly tasted as sweet as she had imagined. The motel room was suffocatingly small, its wallpaper peeling at the edges, the bed creaking every time she shifted. The television flickered with silent news reports, her face plastered across the screen as reporters debated the shocking developments. The air conditioning hummed, but it didn't drown out the thoughts racing in her mind. She glanced at the burner phone on the nightstand, its black screen reflecting her hollow expression. She had sent cryptic messages to Elijah, watching from afar as he unraveled. His grief played out exactly as she had predicted, his face drawn and weary, his sermons fewer and filled with sorrow. But there was an unease creeping into her bones, an unfamiliar doubt gnawing at her. Had she truly won, or had she sentenced herself to a prison of her own making? For the first time, she wasn't sure. The final step in her plan was to return, triumphant, to reclaim her life. She envisioned walking into the police station, confident, smug, and prepared to watch her sister crumble under the weight of the false accusations. But the moment she stepped inside, she realized the game had already turned against her. She had staged her own death with the help of a willing accomplice, an old friend from her past, a woman who looked strikingly like her and had a reason to disappear. The body in the Brooks' home wasn't Regina. It was Sharon Miles, a woman wanted in 3 states, lured into a twisted game of deception. Regina had been meticulous. She spent weeks planning every detail, scouting for the perfect person to take her place. Sharon had been the ideal candidate, on the run, desperate for a fresh start, and easily manipulated. Regina promised her safe passage, new identification, and a fresh beginning, all of which were lies. The moment Sharon stepped into the house, she was doomed. Regina had prepared everything in advance. She collected strands of her own hair and placed them on the victim's clothing. She took a sample of her own blood and smeared it on key surfaces to ensure her DNA would be found. She even left text messages on her phone as if she had been in distress, knowing the investigators would find them and assume she had met a tragic fate. The timing had been impeccable. She disappeared just before Elijah was scheduled to leave town for a conference, ensuring he had an alibi. She had even timed the discovery of the body to coincide with the morning routine of the church secretary, knowing that the sheer shock of finding her would send the community into chaos. She had left just enough breadcrumbs to lead investigators straight to Desiree, her ultimate target. But in her effort to make her plan airtight, she had underestimated one thing: how thoroughly law enforcement would scrutinize every detail. Detectives combed through every piece of evidence, cross-referencing phone records, security footage, and forensic analysis. The inconsistencies began to pile up. Regina's financial records revealed strange cash withdrawals in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, some from cities she was supposedly never in. A gas station attendant remembered seeing a woman matching Regina's description, wearing a wig and sunglasses, paying in cash and glancing over her shoulder repeatedly. Then there was the biggest red flag, an anonymous tip received at the police station just days before Regina's dramatic reappearance. A voice, disguised and static-ridden, had simply said, "You're looking at the wrong sister." This tip led detectives to revisit the DNA samples, re-examining trace evidence on the knife and in the crime scene. And then, the break came, a single, out-of-place fingerprint on the motel's telephone receiver. It didn't belong to Regina, Sharon, or Desiree. Someone else had been involved. Someone who had been watching from the shadows, ensuring Regina's plan unfolded without a hitch. But who? And why? Why? Because she wanted revenge. Regina knew about the affair. She had known for months. And while most women might have confronted their cheating husband or even filed for divorce, Regina wanted justice. Her own brand of it. She had always been the perfect wife, the loyal one, the one who sacrificed. And yet, her own sister had betrayed her. She wasn't going to let Desiree get away with it. Regina's plan was nearly flawless. Nearly, but one thing she hadn't accounted for was Sharon Miles' past catching up with her. Days before Regina reappeared, a fingerprint analyst noticed inconsistencies in the body's prints. The ridges and patterns didn't quite align with previous records of Regina Brooks. At first, it was dismissed as a simple clerical error, but a second check was ordered by a more meticulous officer. When the new results came in, the body was identified as Sharon Miles, a fugitive with a long criminal history. This revelation sent shockwaves through the department. How had a woman with no known connection to the Brooks family ended up in Regina's home, dressed in her nightgown, with a crime scene staged so convincingly? Investigators began piecing together a timeline, tracking Sharon's last known whereabouts and comparing them to the financial records and movements of Regina herself. The truth started unraveling quickly. Surveillance footage from a bus terminal showed Sharon and Regina together just days before the murder. Witnesses later recalled seeing two women arguing in a secluded alley near a rundown motel, one of them wearing a blonde wig. What had started as a straightforward case of domestic murder had suddenly turned into something far more sinister. A web of manipulation, deception, and a deadly game of chess that Regina had been playing from the very start. By the time Regina waltzed into the police station, certain she had executed the crime of the century, the authorities were already closing in. She was arrested on the spot, charged with murder, fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. She watched as the system she had tried to manipulate turned against her. Elijah, shattered and disgraced, resigned from the church and left town. Desiree, having spent weeks behind bars for a crime she didn't commit, walked free, scarred, but alive. Regina's trial became one of the most watched in Alabama history. The defense tried to argue that she never intended to kill Sharon, that it was all an elaborate ruse gone wrong. But the prosecution painted her as a cold, calculating woman who weaponized her own disappearance to destroy her sister. The jury took less than 3 hours to decide. Guilty, Regina Brooks was sentenced to life in prison. And with that, the good wife, the devoted, smiling, church-going woman, became a cautionary tale of what happens when revenge consumes a soul. Years later, an investigative journalist uncovered new evidence suggesting that Regina may not have acted alone. The records of her motel stay indicated she received frequent visits from an unknown man, one whose identity still remains a mystery. Witnesses recalled seeing a tall, well-dressed man slipping into Regina's room late at night, always leaving before dawn. Some said he had the air of a businessman, others swore he was military. But no one ever got a clear look at his face. More intriguing still, security footage revealed a second burner phone was in use during Regina's time at the motel, and it was traced to calls made to a number registered under an alias. Investigators now believe that whoever this man was, he wasn't just a visitor. He was a conspirator. But what was his role in the deception? Did he help Regina plan her escape, or was he the true mastermind behind the elaborate scheme? Authorities have reopened aspects of the case, but for now, Regina remains behind bars, holding on to whatever secrets she still keeps. One thing is certain. Someone else was in on this, and they're still out there, watching, waiting, and perhaps planning their next move. As Montgomery tries to move past the events that left a deep scar on its community, people still whisper about Regina Brooks, the woman who faked her own death, framed her sister, and nearly got away with it. Her story has since been adapted into books, a documentary, and even a crime drama series. But one question still lingers. Who was the man visiting her at the motel? And was he her true accomplice? The case, once thought to be solved, may have just begun another chapter.